Hi, welcome to the week one lecture in Soccer 1050. And what I'm going to do this week is very broadly introduce you to the three areas of sociology that we'll be looking at in the course that we interlink throughout the course. So that's the sociology of youth, sociology of crime, and sociology of gender. So this first lecture is very much a kind of reminder, I suppose, from stuff that you may have seen in first year. So some of the stuff might be familiar already, but we're doing this in week one just kind of ground you in the basics of what's to come. And then this is also then going to be useful for thinking about the more specific things we look at throughout the course. So in terms of part one, I'm going to look at the sociology of youth. So basically the sociology of youth and youth studies is concerned with the lives of young people. Importantly, it's not just research about young people or on young people. It's more about research that's done with young people and from their perspectives. And this is a real kind of distinction. So, almost a political distinction that in terms of what the research is for. And you'll get to kind of understand why, I think, throughout the course. So we look at things about, why, different ways that young people are represented. So we can look at youth as a kind of broad social category. In terms of the positive representations and negative representations, positive stuff about young people are kind of invoked as the future. You see examples of, high achievements in sports and all that kind of stuff. But really what we're looking at critically in this course is the more negative aspects, the kind of moral panicky kind of understanding and representations of youth. Particularly from our perspective in youth studies, we see these moral panics as basically young people being blamed for things that they have really no control over. Kind of individualized or specific groups being blamed for social structural problems. Young people are scapegoated for all kinds of things they really have, no control over at all. This relates to understandings of generations. And now generations is one of those kind of slippery categories in a way. We're interested in from a sociological perspective because no doubt people born into the world at certain times, face different economic, social, cultural and political circumstances, so we'll have kind of different attitudes towards things. But we're also kind of skeptical of generations, particularly the way that they're overgeneralized and, millennials are selfish and, young people refuse to buy a house because they eat too many avocados and all that kind of stuff. They tend to ignore, what we call contours of inequality, the way that kind of, people from a similar age may have some commonalities, but really they're also very different based on things such as class, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and those kind of things. So when we look broadly at youth as a kind of social category, what we're interested in those generalities is how age relations are relations of power. And we're interested in particularly how youth as a category are kind of used and abused in different forms of representations. But as I just said, it's very important not to treat all young people as the same. So youth studies as a field is relatively new. There's always been kind of social science research done really on young people and about them, but doing things more from their perspective and with them is a relatively recent phenomenon. So it's developed, since the 80s and 90s. It's very kind of prominent in the global north, around particularly UK and Australia. In youth studies itself, the global south is particularly still underrepresented, and this is a real problem for the field. Kind of rises, being influenced by the Birmingham School, the subcultural studies that you would have looked at in first semester in some of the introductory courses, around subcultures and resistance, those kind of things, how, spectacular forms of resistance against mainstream society, and how, therefore, writing against some of those Marxist ideas that all popular culture and consumption is done from a kind of cultural dupe, pseudo-individualized theistic perspective. They point out that there's various activities and practices that may be kind of resistance or creative or subversive. The other kind of part of youth studies has been the transitions. So there's youth cultures on the one hand, youth transitions on the other, and this is the study of the kind of transitions from being a child through being a youth to being an adult. Leaving the family home and getting your own place to live, moving through education and getting a full-time job, finding a partner and developing a family and things like that. What the actual youth studies research has shown over the past couple of decades is that period of liminality that is youth, that period between being a child and an adult, has kind of elongated and it's complex and blurry. Those markers of adulthood, getting a full-time job, getting your own place to live, getting married, having kids, kind of maybe one time being ticked off by the time you're 25. These are happening much later and sometimes not happening at all now. And there's a whole bunch of economic and social reasons because of that. So youth studies, the Journal of Youth Studies was established in 1998, so that kind of makes it almost an official field. People have something to publish there in terms of what we do specifically. There's dozens of conferences around the world every year in youth studies, and it's kind of burgeoning field in many ways. We continue to look at the importance of the way that different contours of inequality affect the opportunities and life chances of young people, and how it kind of mitigates the different risks they're exposed to. That's been the traditional centre of the field of youth studies. More recent work brings in, notions of space and time, affect, labour, digital culture, many other kind of more contemporary concerns. A really important text in the field is Wynne and White's Rethinking Youth, a really foundational kind of part of the canon, really. What they want to kind of point out is that I suppose thinking about youth as a relational concept. I need to consider relationships between young people, between specific groups of young people, and between powerful institutions and young people. What this kind of challenge is to kind of really challenge the assumptions of much of the kind of stereotypical understandings of young people, particularly around that kind of developmental period when, that transition from child to adult. Throughout that youth period, we're maturing to become some kind of responsible adult. Now, that's not to challenge, cognitive development and all that kind of stuff that goes on in that period, but really it kind of challenges the assumptions about kind of what the difference is between maybe youth and adults throughout certain times in that transition, particularly when we think about things like maturity. I know a lot of very immature adults, for instance, that take lots of risks. When you think about the moral panics about young people, how they apparently don't care about politics or whatever, when really that's a thing across the general population. What this kind of challenging assumptions model wants us to think about is that many of the norms directed at young people today seem to also apply to kind of previous generations. Those markers of adulthood happen much later. So many of the expectations we have on young people don't really fit the current contemporary circumstances. So one area here is the youth transitions, and I mentioned already, school to work, domestic transitions, housing. These have kind of been key areas of research in youth studies. And we see that these things are more complex than some kind of linear transition. Not really a straight line anymore. There's kind of one step forward, one step back. You might move out of home to go to university, and university finishes. You can't get enough full-time work or work at all to support yourself. You move back at home. You might move out and with a partner and you break up, and then you move in with a share house, and you have a part-time job, and you might have to move cities and all this kind of stuff. The kind of settling down idea of adulthood is increasingly rare in that sense and happens much later. So the transition in itself has been critiqued, and on the other side of the coin, in a way, the very idea of adulthood then needs to be something we need to think about. If you can't really tick off those markers until much later in life, what does the very idea of adulthood mean? So young people's biographies in this sense are kind of, they're much more complex than previous generations because they have to deal with, many more things and many more risks, many more precarities than previous generations. This has seen in particular the rise of notions of becoming and belonging become important in youth studies that we'll look at a little bit throughout the course as well. A really important thing, I think, to consider about young people when we look at all the different kind of case studies and topics that we do throughout the course is the way that young people are treated by expertise. And by expertise, I include sociologists and youth studies. Sociologists aren't immune to some of the problems that I'm about to point out. So really, young people are often seen as kind of problem to be controlled or disciplined by experts, to be regulated, to be made better. They kind of, if the young people are good, the future's going to be good. And if young people, particular groups of young people, are exposed to taking risks or committing crime or whatever, they need to be fixed. And experts are called in to do this kind of thing. What some of the foundational youth studies research shows is that many of these interventions into young people's lives, even done with positive, good motivations, doesn't necessarily have positive outcomes for those young people. Much of the interventions into the lives of young people seems to kind of create labelling processes that we'll look at in the course in a couple of weeks. And these can affect young people's lives quite negatively. So I'll go into some detail about that in future weeks. But it's important here to think about, like, people in this course are no doubt studying sociology, criminology, social work, human services. These disciplines are all about intervening in particularly into what we call at-risk young people's lives, to help them, make them better. But what we find too sometimes is that any kind of intervention and institutionalization of young people doesn't necessarily have positive effects. The critical literature here points out that many of these interventions are about making them, good workers, productive citizens, more so than, being happy or being satisfied or, feeling good about themselves. So this is, I think, a really important critical position to think for students early in their study and early in their kind of, trajectories towards various human services and caring services careers, that we really need to be kind of critically reflexive about our own practices and what these interventions mean. Particularly because, things like sociology, psychology, criminology have been, very obviously pointed out that they've played key roles in colonialism and neoliberalizing processes. So even critical disciplines can often reproduce power systems and inequalities. I've got a link there to Chelsea Watago's really amazing lecture, for instance, on her argument that, say, a discipline like criminology, there's an argument to actually abolish it because it's been so central to the and so complicit in the sanctioning of colonial violence. So if you're interested in this kind of critical perspective, I thoroughly recommend that you check out that lecture. Okay, I'll leave the sociology of youth there and come back and talk about the sociology of crime.